Hello, this is A Walk in the Park by Anthony Brown. Every day I'll be sending out an email to you with a different activity for this book. You can either listen to the book, listen and read along, or turn off my voice and read it yourself. A Walk in the Park. A Walk in the Park. One morning, Mr. Smith and his little girl Smudge took their dog Albert for a walk. On that same morning, Mrs. Smythe and her son Charles were taking their dog Victoria for a walk. Smudge, Mr. Smith and Albert went into the park. Mrs. Smythe, Charles and Victoria arrived soon afterwards. Albert was impatient to be let off his lead. Victoria waited quietly until Mrs. Smythe had detached the lead from her collar. Both dogs were free. They chased each other all over the park. Mr. Smith went to sit at one end of a bench and Smudge sat with him. Mrs. Smythe sat at the other end with Charles. Smudge and Charles looked at each other. Albert and Victoria raced along the paths, dodging round trees, leaping over flower beds. First Albert chased Victoria, then Victoria chased Albert, then Albert chased Victoria again so quickly that sometimes it was difficult to tell them apart. While the dogs played, Smudge and Charles edged nearer and nearer to each other. Mr. Smith and Mrs. Smythe looked the other way. Smudge went on the swings, swinging higher and higher, as high as she dared. Charles wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, an angry gardener chased the dogs off the flower bed. They took off their coats and Smudge swung like a monkey on the climbing frame. Albert felt too hot, so to cool himself he plunged into the fountain. Smudge and Charles climbed a tree. They all played on the bandstand. The whole world seemed happy. But Mr. Smith read his newspaper at one end of the bench and Mrs. Smythe looked the other way. Charles picked a flower and gave it to Smudge. "Here, Albert! Here, Smudge!" yelled Mr. Smith. "Time for home!" "Come here, Victoria! Come along, Charles!" called Mrs. Smythe. "Time for lunch!" Mrs. Smythe took Charles and Victoria home. Mr. Smith took home Smudge and Albert. And Smudge kept the flower.